It is May of 1933 in Princeton, Indiana, and the Great Depression has a tight grip on the land. A 12-year-old boy named Charles Beckner watches from a wagon as his father, Lee Beckner, faces down a larger man named Frank over a sack of seed corn. Frank threatens violence, but Lee does not flinch. He tosses a pitchfork at Frank's feet and invites him into a nearby stable to settle the matter. The three-tined steel fork glints in the shaft of sunlight, and Lee's voice is rock steady. Frank stares at the weapon, then at Lee, and he backs down without a fight. On the ride home, Lee tells his son that the world is full of bullies and that the trick is to convince them you will hurt them worse than they can hurt you. Charles never forgets that lesson. 6 years later, in October of 1939, Charles Beckner is a young sailor awaiting the start of Hospital Corps School at Balboa Naval Hospital in San Diego. He spends his free time in the hospital library, reading newspapers with an atlas and dictionary at his side. The librarian, a woman named Susan, notices his steady habit and one afternoon pulls him aside. She gives him a pocket dictionary and a small Rand McNally atlas, along with several books from the discard shelf, including a worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. She tells him that an admiral once called it the best book ever written by a military man. Charles tucks the books into his sea bag and carries them with him through every station that follows. They become the foundation of a habit of self-education that will serve him in ways he cannot yet imagine. On the 16th of October 1940, Charles Beckner stands at the rail of the USS Chaumont as it steams under the Golden Gate Bridge, bound for Manila. He enlisted in the Navy the previous year, completed basic training at Great Lakes, and was selected for Hospital Corps School in San Diego. Now, after 3 weeks at sea with a stop in Hawaii, the Chaumont enters Manila Bay. The morning sun reveals a sprawling city of modern buildings and church towers, framed by the green mountains of Bataan and the fortress island of Corregidor. A veteran chief petty officer points out the landmarks. Charles breathes the unfamiliar air thick with copra and charcoal smoke, and he wonders what kind of war is waiting for him on this side of the world. Beckner stepped off the Navy bus at Canyacao Hospital and reported for duty. The heat and humidity hit him like a wall, but the hospital itself was impressive. 3 stories of white stucco under a canopy of mahogany trees. As he approached the surgical ward, a nurse turned from the desk. It was Mary Finian, the red-haired lieutenant from Mare Island who had vanished without a word 6 months earlier. She rushed to embrace him, and for a moment the years of formality dissolved. They had been friends back in California, and now here she was, assigned to the very same hospital on the far side of the world. Mary Finian explained that she had been offered an emergency transfer to the Philippines and had sailed on the same ship Charles had taken from San Francisco. The Navy had not bothered to tell him she was aboard. Over the following weeks, they fell into an easy routine, sharing coffee during breaks and trading news from home. She teased him about his promotion to petty officer, and he teased her about never writing. But beneath the banter, both sensed that the easy peacetime days were numbered. Japanese forces were pressing deeper into Indochina, and the patrol planes from nearby Sangley Point were flying longer and longer missions. In early 1941, Beckner was called into the office of Chief Toole, the hospital's senior enlisted administrator. Toole handed him a thick manila envelope. Beckner opened it to find promotion orders elevating him to pharmacist's mate 3rd class. The raise in pay was welcome, but the real surprise came when Toole pulled a heavy knife from beneath his desk. It was a model 1904 Hospital Corps knife, 17 inches of steel with a leather scabbard. Toole said he had carried it for years but would soon rotate back to the States. He passed it to Beckner, telling him that a corpsman in the field needed a tool for cutting saplings, building shelters, and, if necessary, defending himself. Beckner strapped the knife to his belt and wore it during his new duties at the Cavite Gunnery Range. There, he volunteered to train on the Browning M250 caliber machine gun alongside regular sailors and Marines. The weapon was loud and violent in his hands, but he qualified on both the 50 and the 30 caliber. The range instructor told him that in a war, a corpsman might be the last man standing who knew how to fire a gun. Beckner did not argue. He spent his off hours studying the machine gun manual and practicing the 2-second burst that would keep a barrel from overheating. One Saturday evening in October, Beckner was dealing poker in the lee of the Patwing 10 hangar while a typhoon lashed the peninsula. A Marine named Jack lost heavily and accused Beckner of cheating. Beckner ended the game, and as he walked through the rain to his barracks, Jack stepped out of the darkness with a fighting knife. The driving rain limited their world to 10 feet. Beckner reached behind his back and drew the Model 1904, letting it hang at his side. He told Jack that the core knife could do single-stroke amputations and that even if he got cut, Jack would not walk away. The Marine stared, cursed, and retreated into the storm. The confrontation never went further, but it echoed the lesson Beckner had learned from his father years before in an Indiana stable. You do not have to win the fight. You just have to convince the other man that you will hurt him worse than he will hurt you. Jack did not report the incident, and Beckner did not mention it to his superiors, but he kept the knife on his belt and began sleeping with it under his pillow. The Philippines were becoming a dangerous place for quiet men. In October 1941, Beckner received orders transferring him to VP 102 at Olongapo, a small seaplane base on Subic Bay. He flew up in a Grumman duck and reported to the squadron's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Edgar Neal. Neal was all business, and he made it clear that war was coming soon. The base was a mix of old warehouses and new defensive works. Carpenter's mate George Gabory was building wooden PBY decoys to confuse Japanese pilots. A fuel barge full of Avgas rode low in the water, and hundreds of barrels of aviation fuel were cached in hidden coves. Days later, the first transport ships arrived from Shanghai carrying the 4th Marine Regiment. 700 Marines poured off the decks and spread through the Navy Yard, setting up field kitchens and sandbag machine gun nests. Beckner watched them dig in, their uniforms still smelling of sea salt from the voyage. The Marines built a regimental hospital with 12 beds, expandable to 100, and Beckner helped stock it with the medical supplies he had scavenged from Cavite. On the first weekend of December, the PBYs were flying patrols that stretched to the limits of their fuel. Every man knew the Japanese would come, and the only question was when. On the morning of December 8, 1941, Charles Beckner was eating breakfast at the Olongapo mess hall when a radio man burst through the door, shouting that Japanese planes had bombed Pearl Harbor. The news hit like a physical blow. Men set down their coffee cups and stared at each other. Beckner rose from his bench and walked to the window, looking out at the PBYs rocking at their buoys in Subic Bay. Every patrol he had flown on, every report of Japanese ship movements he had helped log, every long night of waiting, it had all been pointing to this moment. The war was no longer coming, it was here. Within hours, confirmation arrived that Japanese bombers had also struck Clark Field north of Manila, catching MacArthur's B-17s and P-40s on the ground. The American Air Force in the Philippines was gutted in a single morning. Beckner watched the VP 102 ground crews scramble to disperse the remaining PBYs into hidden coves along the coast. Lieutenant Commander Edgar Neal stood on the dock shouting orders over the drone of warming engines. There was no panic in his voice, only hard urgency. Beckner grabbed his medical kit and began checking the emergency supplies he had stockpiled, knowing the wounded would come soon enough. Transferred to Sangley Point to reinforce the dispensary, Beckner was there on December 10th when he felt the ground shake before he heard the planes. He looked up to see wave after wave of Japanese bombers crossing the sky toward Cavite Navy Yard. The first bombs hit the fuel storage tanks, and black smoke boiled into the air like a thunderhead rolling backward. Beckner ran to the dispensary and began pulling bandages, morphine syrettes, and splints from the cabinets. A truck skidded to a halt outside, its bed loaded with bleeding men, their uniforms torn and blackened by blast and fire. The Cavite Navy Yard was a hell of twisted metal and burning warehouses. Beckner worked for hours, kneeling beside wounded sailors and civilian workers, pressing bandages into shrapnel wounds, splinting shattered arms, and injecting morphine into men who screamed as he passed. The heat from the fires pressed against his face like an open oven door. At one point he looked up and saw a PBY at the Sangley Point dock with its wing on fire, crewmen leaping into the water. He turned back to the man in front of him. a machinist's mate with a deep gash across his scalp and tied off the bandage. With the base burning and Japanese fighters strafing the waterfront, the order came to evacuate. Beckner helped load the most seriously wounded onto a small wooden barge tied to the hospital dock. Men with burns, fractures, and sucking chest wounds lay side by side on the deck, their groans low and constant. Beckner moved among them, checking tourniquets and adjusting dressings as the barge pulled away from the pier. He turned back for one last look at Cavite. The sky was orange with fire. Smoke rolled across the bay like a curtain closing on everything they had built there. He did not look away until the barge rounded the point and Corregidor came into view. On Corregidor, Beckner reported to the Malinta Tunnel, the sprawling underground complex carved into the heart of the island. The tunnel hospital was a cavern lined with bunks, lit by bare bulbs, and filled with the smell of iodine and blood. He found Mary Finian working a triage station near the entrance, her uniform streaked with dirt and dried blood. She nodded when she saw him. No smile, only the recognition of another pair of hands. They worked side by side for days, treating the wounded who had been ferried across from Bataan and from the burning Cavite shore. In mid-January 1942, Beckner received orders reassigning him from Patwing 10 to Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3. The squadron's commander, Lieutenant John Bulkley, needed a corpsman who could handle more than sick call. Beckner packed his medical kit and his Model 1904 core knife and reported to the PT boat dock. Bulkley shook his hand and said, "We run at night, we shoot at anything that moves, and we don't stop for bandages until the fight is over." "You ready for that?" Beckner said he was. The PT boats were wooden-hulled, 77 feet long, and armed with 4 torpedoes and 450 caliber machine guns. Beckner was assigned to MTB-3, a boat whose crew included a wiry machinist's mate named Bill Johnson and a young torpedoman who chewed tobacco and never stopped talking. Their nights were a rhythm of patrol and ambush. They slipped out of hidden coves after dark, throttled down to idle past Japanese destroyers, and then punched the engines to full speed, launching torpedoes and weaving through the phosphorescent wakes of enemy searchlights. Beckner manned a .50 caliber gun during the run-ins, the lesson from the Cavite gunnery range paying off in the dark. Between patrols, Beckner treated the constant stream of minor injuries, burns from hot brass casings, cuts from sharp metal, and the gray exhaustion that sat in every man's eyes. He also treated malaria cases among the crews, breaking out the quinine tablets he had stashed in his sea bag back in June, a decision that now seemed almost prophetic. One night in February, a .50 caliber round cooked off in the gun mount, sending a sliver of brass into a gunner's forearm. Beckner pulled the fragment, cleaned the wound, and had the man back at his gun within the hour. Bulkley watched and said nothing, but he nodded. On April 9, 1942, Beckner was crammed into the pitching deck of a PT boat fleeing south through the Visayas when the radio man picked up the announcement that Bataan had fallen. The radio crackled with the official surrender, and the men around him fell silent. He thought of the soldiers and nurses he had left behind on Luzon, and then he turned back to his work. The war was not over, not for him. The journey south became a desperate run after the surrender. They traveled only at night, cutting engines at the first sign of Japanese patrols, hiding in mangrove estuaries by day. Beckner treated saltwater-infected cuts and exhaustion as they pushed deeper into the southern islands. He checked his medical kit and prepared for a different kind of war. On the 10th of April, a flight of Japanese dive bombers found the small flotilla hiding among the islands. The attack came fast and low, the roar of engines filling the narrow channel between 2 mangrove-covered islets. Beckner was below deck when the first bombs straddled the boat, sending geysers of water high enough to drench the gunners at their posts. He emerged into chaos, finding 3 men wounded by shrapnel, one with a deep gash across his thigh that pulsed dark blood against the deck planks. He worked without pausing, applying tourniquets, packing wounds, and keeping the injured conscious, while helmsman Lieutenant John Bulkley zigzagged the boat toward the lee of a limestone cliff. By the 3rd week of April, the squadron was effectively destroyed, its boats either sunk, scuttled, or scattered beyond communication. Beckner and a small group of sailors found themselves on the coast of Mindanao, their last usable PT boat too damaged to risk. With Japanese patrols closing in, they abandoned the coast and moved inland, carrying what supplies they could. Beckner checked his medical kit, knowing that the next phase of the war would be fought not from the sea, but from the jungle. On the island of Mindanao, Beckner linked up with Filipino irregulars who were already melting into the hill country with whatever weapons they had salvaged. He brought two things the guerrillas needed desperately: a radio and a sea bag stuffed with medical supplies, including the 1,000 quinine tablets he had stashed months earlier at Sangley Point. Malaria was already beginning to hollow out the men who had survived the bombs and the bullets, and Beckner moved from hut to hut, dosing the shivering and the feverish, knowing that without the medicine, the resistance would die before it ever truly began. Then, in the final days of April, a radio message from Australia crackled through the static, promising an evacuation for 20 Navy nurses still trapped on Mindanao. 2 PBY seaplanes were dispatched, flying north from Australia on a round trip of more than 1,600 miles each way. The first plane touched down on the mountain lake of Lanao, its floats kissing the dark water as the nurses, Mary Finian among them, scrambled aboard. The second PBY, piloted by Lieutenant Thomas Pollock, landed shortly after, and the refugees hauled themselves through the waste hatches with the sound of Japanese armor grinding closer through the coastal lowlands. As the mechanics prepared to refuel the second aircraft, a native boat began towing the heavy seaplane away from the dock. The line went slack, the current caught the wing float, and the PBY drifted directly over a shelf of submerged rocks that no one had seen. The hull tore open with a sound like ripping sheet metal, and water flooded the navigation compartment. Pollock gunned both engines and beached the crippled plane on the shore before it could sink outright, the nose grinding into the mud as the passengers scrambled onto dry land. Standing on the beach, Beckner looked back at the damaged PBY and understood that the next move would be the last one he had left. Dawn broke over Lake Lanao on the morning of May 1st. The beached PBY sat half-submerged at the shore, its hull torn open from the submerged rocks. A column of Japanese armored vehicles was reported only minutes away, closing on their position. Beckner, standing at the starboard gun blister, watched the dark green mountains surrounding the lake and accepted that his final view of the world might be this very place. The crew had worked through the night, pulling a wool army blanket under the hull and fixing it in place with rope. There was no time to test the repair. Pollock taxied the plane away from the shore, the aluminum hull vibrating from the pounding of small waves. Without warning, the blanket lost suction and blew loose, flapping against the tail control surfaces. Water began to rise over Beckner's ankles. Pollock pushed the throttles to full power, attempting a downwind takeoff. The overloaded plane fought to gain altitude, skimming the waves. Every man aboard knew it was do or die. Slowly, grudgingly, the PBY rose a few feet into the air. It cleared the surrounding mountains by a margin measured in feet. The plane was airborne, on course for Australia. 3 months later, having reached Australia, Beckner volunteered to return to Mindanao. He boarded a submarine for the journey back, carrying his core knife and the few medical supplies he had left. The Japanese now held every major port and city on the island. The organized American resistance was gone, reduced to scattered bands of guerrilla fighters in the hills. Beckner linked up with the same Filipino irregulars he had treated before the evacuation. He set up a makeshift clinic in the hill country, using his stashed quinine and quinacrine to combat the malaria that ravaged the guerrilla fighters. He treated hundreds of men with fevers, wounds, and infections, stretching each bottle of medicine to its absolute limit. The war ended in September 1945. Beckner returned to the United States and remained in the Navy. For his actions in the Philippines, he received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with 2 oak leaf clusters, and a Purple Heart earned on Okinawa. He rose to the rank of Chief Warrant Officer 4, serving for 3 more decades before retiring. Chief Toole, who had passed Beckner his core knife, rotated safely back to the States before the war broke out. Mary Finian survived the war and returned to the United States. Thomas Pollock made it out of the Philippines and continued his naval aviation career. John Bulkley became one of the most decorated naval officers of the war. His PT boat exploits celebrated across the country. Marine Jack, the man Beckner faced in the storm, was killed in the fighting on Bataan. Carpenter's mate George Gabory survived the war and returned to Michigan. Charles Beckner was interred with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery in 2009. A photo from his later years shows him in dress uniform, his chest covered with ribbons earned across a lifetime of service. He stands straight, unsmiling, as if still on watch. Lieutenant Commander Edgar Neal remained with his squadron, was evacuated to Australia, and later commanded a naval air station in California. The story of Charles Beckner is the story of thousands of Americans who served in the Pacific. They were told they were expendable. They fought anyway, not for glory, but for each other. Beckner once wrote that dying was not his cup of tea, and he intended to postpone it as long as possible. He lived by those words, and he kept his promise. If you have a family member who served in the Pacific, or if you have your own memories of that war, we would love to hear about them in the comments below. Please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. It helps us bring more of these stories to light. Thank you for watching and for remembering.